We want to continue on. The whole subject matter now is the mystery of Christ. This is all about Christ now. And there's no end to the subject. I have spent 5 years on this book, The Real Christ, and the more you get into it, I hate to say it, but the more complicated it has been made. Christ is utterly simple, but has been made so difficult that I don't think people today can really grasp the real Christ anymore. It's gone. And that's why I wrote the book. It's called The Real Christ, is because I think it's gone from Christianity. And so this book was my research, going back to find out where the early church could have made some wrong turns that could ever, so that Christianity would end up as a Jesus cult. That was my research, to find out what the Father said, what Paul, all these successors coming down to us, and these councils, and what went on here with all that, because Christ was a huge problem. I said before, the Trinity just emerged as of itself, just a foregone conclusion. Whereas Christ was a huge problem. And we'll get to that problem. But let us start at the beginning here. We've already defined Christ as God creating a human nature for itself, a human nature totally one with itself. This is the definition of Christ, which means it is man's oneness with God. This was God's plan for man from the beginning of his creation, according to Paul. This was God's plan from the beginning. Now, at what time God actually created its human nature is irrelevant. We cannot put timing on Almighty God. We only know this, that it's only at the time of when Jesus was born that Christ was revealed. Now, other people prior to Christ had gone to heaven and been transformed into what we Christians call Christ. They themselves might not. Their oneness with God, I don't think they wouldn't have called it Christ. So Christ is a title. And this is the Christian, we're giving you the Christian, the initial Christian understanding of the term Christ, which was not Jewish. And this is where I would ask everybody to take off their Christian glasses for a few minutes and consider the man Jesus, his own mindset, his own culture, his own religion. He never knew Christianity. He never read the New Testament. He never knew the Trinity. He never knew Christ. So we have to understand him in his own paradigm. And it is said, they say, and it's somewhat believable, that he thought of himself as this promised Messiah. And what was that? What was the Messiah to do? It was to save Israel. There was no understanding that the Messiah would come to save everybody in the world. Save Israel, establish a kingdom of Israel, and therefore bring peace to Israel and its surrounding countries, supposedly. We're still waiting for that to happen. So this was his understanding of the Messiah, was to save the people of Israel and to allow them to be their own kingdom and to bring peace in this matter. You have to remember, at the time of Jesus, the Romans ruled the whole thing. And given the history of the Jews, they had a hard time hanging on to any land of their own. We know they fought consistently to have a piece of this world. And so this was the Messiah, was to be this promise. My understanding also that there was going to be peace. Don't quote me on this because I'm not sure. Peace for 1,000 years before the end of the world would come. And it's also said Jesus, very much in his preaching, he thought the end of the world was coming. He thought the end of the world was to be soon. I don't know where he got that from. But as he said, he came to bring the sword. That father and mother, would be what daughters would be against mothers and sons against fathers, and he it was pretty chaotic, his view here. He wasn't a family man, with his cohesion here. And as Paul said, he said, well, Paul also thought the end of the world was coming any time. And he also said, well, if you're married, live as if you weren't. In other words, don't get married now. In other words, these people were not family people. Let's put it that way. And something else that very, very important, that the whole world should know this. The belief, not just of Jews, but all the Greek philosophers, and I know the people in India because I researched that too, that religion. They believed that there was one original soul. One original soul. And that this soul was passed down via the man's sperm or semen, passed down from one generation to the other, from father to son, from father to son. The women, the womb was just a depository where the child could grow. But the father contributed that soul, and it was his own soul. But this was kind of passed on, not that he was left without one. Aristotle said it was one flame. The soul is one living flame, and it's passed on from one candle to another. Now, you're going to have all these candles are individual candles, but this same soul is passed on from one to the other to the other. This was a belief in India, the belief of the Greek, the belief of the whole world. Well, when you come to Judaism, this soul that got passed on was a damaged soul of Adam. Adam was the first human soul. And so this was damaged. The Jews don't believe in original sin, but then neither do none of the early fathers did either. That was Augustine came up with that whole idea. But they did believe that, like the Jews, that this flawed soul was definitely carried on. In fact, someplace in the Bible it says that the fathers' sins are what? Something on the son for the third what? Visited on the sons to the third generation here. That's fine. Anybody can fill me in with this biblical business, more great. But so they did believe that, I don't like the word sin, but this whole flawed thing was carried on from one soul to another. And I want to tell you, I really researched this. The female ovum, the egg necessary to conceive of a child, was only discovered, I have it in my book underneath the Theotokos. I've got the guy who did it. He was a Frenchman, and I could read it to you. But he's the one who discovered it. And anyway, you can kind of look that up for yourself. Where is this here? This Theotokos business, that's acknowledgement. So Theotokos is the last thing in this book about Mary. And, yeah, this is Theotokos. Well, it's a footnote, a big footnote here. Yeah. Carl Ernst von Baer proved that mammals, including humans, developed from eggs. Baer concludes every animal which springs from the cohesion of male and female is developed from an ovum and none from a simple formative liquid, like semen. Now, you can only see the ovum with microscopes. You can only get those eggs with microscopes. And so all these, in the history of man, until we had microscopes, it was understood that the male was the one who, really reproduced. The female had nothing to do with that. You didn't need the egg, you didn't really need the female, but you did need a womb for the child to grow in. That's all she was. And so we have this view around. This was Paul's view, this is Jesus' view, this is everybody's view here, which we know now is not scientific at all, which is why I say in the what has come down to us is the incarnation. You know, Luke's account of the Holy Spirit, the Most High will overshadow. It's a beautiful representation of the Trinity. The Most High overshadowing, well, that shadow on what it meant to Plato too, what it meant to Moses, and in Scripture, shadow is a big term. And there's the Most High, that transcendent. And then comes the Holy Spirit will come upon you. And this is going to create the soul. And of course, that Logos is in you. That Logos is already in you. The Fathers concluded that Logos was already in her. And of course, the Logos is the one that has the contact with matter. Okay, we've already gone over the Logos. It's contact with matter, so that's going to create the body. The Spirit is going to create the soul. And then we have this, the Most High overshadowing the whole thing, because that everybody's grounded in the Most High anyway. So we have a beautiful representation of the Trinity there. But ask yourself, what would God do without Mary? How could you have had an incarnation without Mary? Without that ovum? God provided the male part of conceiving a child. Jesus was no more a child of God than he was of Mary. But of course, the Fathers always said he's born of the flesh of Mary. This was, born of Mary. And anyway, we're not going to get into the what we call Theotokos, Mother of God business here. But this is why Paul said he was like us in every way but sin. Remember, he would this is a famous saying, Jesus is like us in every way but sin. Well, where did he get this idea that but sin? And that's because Jesus had no human father. If Jesus has had a human father, the belief would have been that, he's born like everybody else, is flawed, sin, maybe the third generation, however they saw it. In other words. Now, is there any truth to that? No. God creates every soul one-on-one. We don't come from our parents at all. The soul doesn't. Parents will provide the physical genes. In God, the growth and the soul is the one that informs the body, that makes it grow into what it is. But that genes will be in the flesh. But the soul is created one-on-one by God, and God cannot create sin. God could no more create sin than there's a man living in the moon. It's impossible. No man is born with sin. There is no such thing. We are born as just as pure and good as Adam. So what about this thing? But that's why he said that he's like us in every way but sin. And of course all the Fathers believe this, and this has been handed down in the church. This has been handed down to Christianity, and there's no truth to it at all. Now, because Paul believed it, though, he had to, what one author calls very astutely, he had to make the diagnosis fit the cure. If Christ came to save everybody, save them from what? Well, there's Paul, save you from sin. He's going to make it possible. Adam fell and didn't meet couldn't go ahead with his transformation into this oneness with God. And so Christ came and made this possible. This is Paul's paradigm. This is his view of it. This is how he made the diagnosis to fit the cure. First you got the cure. If Christ didn't come to save you, well, why do you need him? If Jesus didn't save you, if Jesus wasn't a savior, well, who needs him? We're going to get a whole different view of Christianity if we get it right. That nobody's created with sin, and he was no different in that respect at all. So what makes people different now? There's only one human nature. There aren't many. There aren't, one human being is, they have the same human nature as another. So what's going to make for all our differences? Well, the Fathers, not the Fathers, but this is the actual fact. Everybody is created with free will. Everybody's created with free will. The same free will, really. And it's how they use it, for good or for ill, that's going to create the person that they become, the person that they are. Little child's born, a person already formed and characterized and everything. He couldn't. He couldn't even function as that. So what's going to create the person, and that's what's going to create the differences between and among us. The term person means differences. The term nature means sameness. Universal, common nature, different persons. We're all different persons. No two persons are alike. And also, in the incarnation, God never, this is an Orthodox belief. Orthodox, you take it from here. God never created a human person. When God united human nature to itself, it did not unite a particular person to itself. Are you with me there? God never united a human person to itself. God doesn't create human persons. We have our own freedom. This is the marvel of humanity. We are free to make our own person the person that we become. God didn't create a Hitler, and God didn't create a Mother Teresa. They used their free will for or against God. This is their legacy to the world. These are the persons that they were. Some beautiful, some horrible. But don't blame it on God. This is what they made of themselves. They were given this freedom here. And I can't help but think, since God gave us our freedom, nobody could be less surprised at man sinning than God, because God's the one that made it possible. If you couldn't sin, well, then you'd be, it's what I call predestination, that's a farce. There's no, see, predestination robs you of your free will. God created you to be Hitler and a nasty, mean guy and everything. And well, what else can I do? This is it, no, this is silly. God doesn't create any person. Nobody's predestined to be this or that. You have that freedom. That's what it means to be human, is to have that freedom. And so that's what creates person, but not your human nature. God alone creates that human nature, and that's what it is. But we're given to be able to run the show. And let me tell you what they define person as. The fathers defined it. The person was the subject of the soul that governed itself. It was what they call the agent of the soul. That's the one that's going to make the choices, the decisions, responsible for its thoughts, responsible for its deeds. It is the I am, the subject. It's me. I am. This is the person. And it is one's self-identity. And right here on a piece of paper, I don't know if you can read it, but this says what and who. Now, what man is human nature. That's our essence. The essence of what you are is human nature. Who you are, though, is a person. Okay? They mean two different things. Who you are isn't what you are, and what you are isn't who you are. One is nature, and one is person, the who. So remember that. Who is always individual, isn't it? It's always points to a particular being and explains to some extent, if you knew them, maybe one is different from another. And I think it's how they have used their will, how they have lived their life according to how they've used their free will. And so who you are, just remember, who you are is not what you are. And God never created who you are. God creates no who. He doesn't create anybody's self-identity. God, of course, human nature is going to make this possible because in us is that consciousness and self-awareness. That is part of nature. But it's how we're going to use this and function. It's going to create the who. So this is a big difference in what God united to itself wasn't any who. Wasn't a person. Wasn't nobody in particular. It was man's human nature. This is the belief of the fathers. This is Orthodox stuff. That's why they believe that man's salvation was transformation into Christ, into what Christ is. Gregory of Nazianzus says that Christ, as the union of the divine and the human, Christ is not the union of two who's. It's the union of two what's. What God is and what man is. The union of human nature, the essence of human nature, with the essence of God. And sometimes we say, well, what's the essence of human nature? Well, you know what? We don't really know. We've got all kinds of theories. Man's a psyche, he's just a soul, and a Plato's theory. Oh, everybody got these theories of what human nature is. But I say only God knows what God creates. God is the only one who really knows the essence of human nature. We know something about it. But I mean, when it comes to, the bottom line, God's the only one that knows what's created. And sometimes people say, well, we don't know the essence of God. At least in our human terms. Is God light, energy? We have all these crazy ideas. But we don't, in that respect, in our human respect, we don't know the essence of God. So there you're going to have a union and a oneness of two unknowns, essences. And I mean, at the bottom line, we're talking about the bottom line here. And we know a lot about it. But as far as what that is, this is the whole mystery of Christ. Christ is a real mystery. The mystery of God and the mystery of man. And how that they, much less how you can have two totally disparate natures being one. Because the big question is, well, how would that affect? And also we want to remind you, Chalcedon was very, very astute, Chalcedon, when they said that this union of natures, here, the divine and the human, there was no confusion between them. By that I meant there was nothing of this intermixture. This is divine and that's human. There was none of this mixture. No confusion there. And no crossing over the lines. This was the two without separation, without division. And you can't, it's more than a union. That's why the term for this type of union here is called hypostatic union. It's the only term that we have in Christianity for the union of God that is Christ. The union of God and man that is Christ. We only have one term for it in all of Christianity, and that is hypostatic union. Cyril of Alexandria, he lived the end of 300 into 400, he did not like the term himself. And what he meant by it, well, we won't go into monophysitism, but what he meant by it, he didn't like it. He realized later on that wasn't the right way to say it. But I like that term. Not so much union, but oneness. Oneness is neither one nor two. It's a oneness, though. It's two, but it's not two different separate things here. It is a oneness here. But it's not some admixture. We can say, oh, this part's divine and that part's human, and you can't do all that mess. It's not some conglomerate mixture, like you're stirring two things together. They wanted to make them very discreet. Now, this was Chalcedon that did this. And I think, well, I like it. I mean, I think it works. And we'll see Maximus has some beautiful views of it. And Maximus the Confessor, he was, he's called 7th century, but he was born in 500 something, died in 6, I believe. And he's considered the greatest authority on the spiritual life in the Eastern Church. Man's spiritual development. He's basically a monk and wrote for monks. But he has one of the most wonderful views of the end of man's journey that any of the fathers have written about. But anyway, this hypostatic union, yeah. Now, I want to say something about this hypostatic union here. Where are my little dolls here? What typifies the hypostatic union here is that this is a union in God. This is what defines it. It's not a union made with man or in man. It's one that originated and is and remains in the essence of God. Just right in it. With the essence of God. Let me see, I have my little thing here. And I put, now this logos is the one that we call incarnate because it's one with the matter. And so we have human nature here. The logos is one with human nature here, the oneness there. And the two together we call Christ. Now, Christ is not one of the Trinity, though. That's why this is a flawed thing here. Nevertheless, Christ is in the Trinity. Christ is not outside the Trinity. Christ is the oneness of the Logos with human nature. And here we have Christ. Okay. And this is a hypostatic union, but this is a union in God, in the Trinity. Do you see that? Well, I don't know if you see it or not. But anyway, I thought I'd go over this other kind of union that man can have with God here on earth. Now, what we call, I did this for some other retreat here, I think John of the Cross, because he's the one who points these out. He points out these three types of unions that a man has with God, John of the Cross. Of course, the other fathers did too. So, anyway, this is what we call man's essential oneness with God. This is your, by reason of your existence. This is whether you're a sinner or saint, and this is the animals' existence. They are one with God. Everything is one with God. And John the Cross calls this your essential oneness with God, without which you can't exist, okay? You don't exist because of this essential oneness with God. And this is with the Logos, and it's a oneness with, all creation here. More especially, I would say, according to the fathers anyway, with the body. But this is man's essential oneness with God. Now, if you live a good life and do all you can to lead a good life and be the best human being that you can, and also the fathers tended to look upon this as a sacramental kind of union with God. Namely, it's a union of grace. A union of grace. And what is that? What is grace? Grace is defined as the very essence of God. God imparting a divine life to you. This is what grace is. It's not some favor. It's not something else. It's God itself. Grace is God. And God is imparting. And in that imparting of grace to you, there is also transformation. Pardon me for a minute here. So, we're on the transformative level here, which here is just, you're just born with this. Now, depending upon how you use your will, how you live, and everything else, and as I said, the fathers believed in this whole sacramental special anointing and blessing by God and baptism, and you know all the sacraments that you've heard of. And the Eastern Church has more sacraments than but anyway, this is, God can give grace anytime, any place. And that's its own life to you, imparting and you participating in God's life. And this is highly transformative. Now, so this is, you know what? This can make you the greatest saints of the world, the greatest people ever lived. You don't have to get to here. There's just one little problem with this. And this is that people who are in this, have this going for them, this grace, this blessings of God, and they can still fall. Their whole will can change. This is not what they call being confirmed in grace. You're not confirmed in grace. And this state over here, though, is what they have called being confirmed in grace, meaning you can't fall anymore. It's a good question. This is what we call here in the Western Christian literature, we call this a unitive state. It's called transforming union, mystical union. The emotional ones, and call it mystical marriage and that kind of thing. Now, this was also a state that Clement, Clement was I think he was born 150, and he had been a Stoic, and he was a convert, and he thought that Jesus was born in this state, and he called it apatheia. He was a Stoic, and this was that the goal of the Stoics was to reach this state of apatheia. Well, Irenaeus coined it instead. It was no longer apatheia. He coined it theosis, Theosis. Theosis, he called it. Now, theosis is another term for deification. And so this is what they call this more mystical union, theosis. And sometimes deification. They had different references to this here. And this was considered the state in which Jesus was born. They consider this the state because he always knew that he was one with God. And I'm going to come back to this. But what I want to point out is that these unions are all in man. These are all in man himself. This union here, the hypostatic union over here in Christ, this is not in man. This union here was made in, let's say this is the logos, and let's say that this is human nature here. The hypostatic union is in God. It is not in man anywhere. Can't point to it. It's not located in man. Whereas we can say a great deal about these unions with God and point to these to some extent here. We know where God is located in ourselves, and we feel that and know that. But not a hypostatic union. So a hypostatic union, the definition of that is that it's solely in God, it's not in you. And so you can't point to that at all. It's outside of, it's in God. Just put it that way. Now, in the incarnation, sometimes I think the reason that the incarnation happened as it did, with God providing that male, oddly enough, what the incarnation really reveals, if you really understand it, this story of Luke's, it's telling you that without Mary, without that egg, there could have been no incarnation, there could be no Jesus, no Christ. And people didn't get it. I don't think they still get it. That without Mary, there would have been no incarnation. So God is telling us Mary was needed. Why? She had that ovum. And it's also telling us something else that man never got. Never. I'm wondering, well, I think they get it now because it's science. And that is that every soul is created one-on-one by God. It's not passed on from any parent. Jesus' soul was not created by any parent. This came directly from God. Now, this incarnation reveals a whole lot that we've missed completely. I mean, it's enormous, all that it revealed. And so this, it had its purpose, huge purpose. It had nothing to do with the revelation of the man Jesus. This was far, far bigger than just the revelation of some man. And by the way, he wasn't revealed at all because he's not Christ. He was what the fathers called, Irenaeus here referred to the man Jesus as the instrument that God used to reveal Christ. And all the fathers looked upon, Jesus as a model and an example of Christ, of somebody who became Christ. Not that Jesus himself was Christ, but the example and the model, kind of the archetype. And Jesus is our icon of somebody who became Christ, somebody who was one with God. Now, how did he, of course, he was born in this unitive state. I'm all for that. I believe that. I'm convinced of that. But the importance of the incarnation, that God supplying this whole sperm, you might say, being his biological father, was that Mary told Jesus when he was just a toddler, as soon as she could, that his real father wasn't Joseph, and it wasn't any man. It was God. God was his real father. I remember my parents telling me when I was a baby, as early as I could remember, that they were not my real parents, that God was my real parent. Of course, I mean, they didn't mean it in any sense like that. But how that stuck with me, or what that meant to me. Because anytime they get after me, I'd say, well, they're not my real parents anyway. They don't know me. The only one who knows me is God, because God created me. That was my view. Now think of Jesus, who they're saying, you never had a human father. Imagine how this would affect a little toddler. You never had a little father. I mean, a natural father. God was your father. She told him about this marvelous thing that happened to her. And he grew up with that. He knew that. And the advantage of knowing that is that his whole consciousness, being what it was here, he was aware constantly of his oneness with God. Of his oneness with God. He had that consciousness from the beginning. In a way, I say he missed a good one because he never had this egoic consciousness, we might say, of me, myself, and I. It was always us, the Father and I, God and me. And he had that, what you might call God consciousness from the day he was born. And Mary telling him the story was his way to recognize this, recognize his oneness with God. He never had any question about that at all. We have no history of Jesus going to seek enlightenment or seek this or seek God or looking around. Nothing. There's no history of that. And I think it's really marvelous. One of the most beautiful aspects of his life is that nobody knew him any different than anybody else for 30 years until God started working miracles on his behalf. And of course, then comes the crunch. Anybody can work miracles. Of course, he didn't work it. God worked it on his behalf to attract attention to him and what he had to say. But for 30 years, nobody knew him any different than anybody else in the supermarket or in the family. He was the son of Joseph and in the subject. So, this is, I just think it's tremendous here that those years in which he knew he was one with God, it goes to show you don't stand out because you're one with God. Nobody knows it. That you know it and God knows it, and that's it. It's no great accomplishment. It's your daily life. And it's taken for granted. I can't believe that's my purse was one of my kids calling me on my cell phone. Of all the times having this thing filmed, doesn't that crack you up? Oh, I'm not answering it.
Well, of course not, but it gave you a good opportunity to fix your microphone.
Listen, they're still going at it. Who knows who that is? It might be some credit card company after me. They don't have my cell phone. It's just my kids that have my cell phone. That's just why. I'll consult it later. I hope that everything's okay at home. Anyway, so now what was I saying? I'm saying that, this, what we call the hidden years. See, nobody knows anything about him. Nobody thought that he was any different than anybody else. And what happened there is somebody else knew about him, though. Remember, they went to, that has got to go. You know, that means you have a call, one of those things. If we could throw that out the door here. Just throw my purse out the door. I do remember that Mary went to visit her cousin Elizabeth, who was also pregnant. Remember that beautiful little story that her child John leapt in her womb when Mary came in. And so Elizabeth also knew of this wonderful conception of Mary, knew that she had not been married. This was God, no problem there. And she told John about it. Now, John was raised quite apart from Jesus, had never really seen him before, but he knew all about Jesus. He knew how he came into this world. So therefore, when you had this baptism in the river, remember when John says, here he comes, this kind of thing there, as soon as he recognized that Jesus was there, then he what he calls it, he outed him. He said, here comes the one who's going to baptize with the Spirit and so forth. And so he knew about him already. This was no big revelation. I mean, this is family stuff. And so he recognized him, and it's at that time that, see, some people, the reason I'm going over this is because sometimes people say, oh, that's when Jesus knew he was one with God. Remember when somebody heard this voice, I don't know if it was Jesus or John, heard this voice say, this is my beloved son. Can't remember what else. Anyway, that they say at this time Jesus knew he was one with God. Oh, no way. No way. This is when God made him known to others. To John. He was there for John, and John announced him to others. And immediately he ran up because this was announced. People evidently heard this. And he immediately went off by himself after this to think about this, being known, to other people. And how that would work. Because this is something about Jesus important to understand. He was totally Jewish. But he knew one thing that was not Jewish. That Judaism does not believe that any man is one with God. This is why they killed him, because he said this, that he was one with God. This is not in Judaism. They regarded this as heretical and blasphemous. See, the Jews have this kind of idea, kind of makes you equal to God if you're one with God, and this kind of thing. They can't handle it. And so Jesus didn't want this to be known, because he thought that he had a different mission for them, and it wasn't relevant, or they shouldn't know this, because this is not in Judaism. And you have to understand also in Judaism that the common belief was that the Messiah pre-existed his coming into the world. That's why when Jesus says, before Abraham I was, well, all the Jews, that was no problem, because the Jews believed the Messiah already existed and were just waiting for God to say, go, and then he would come to this earth and do the Messiah bit here. And so this was Jesus' view too, that before, that he kind of, as a Messiah, existed prior to his coming into this world. That was a Jewish belief. And so, how can we say this? Anyway, my whole point of going over this is that Jesus had a totally Judaic view of his life, of God, what he was about. And therefore, and he thought that the Messiah had to die for all this, and so he went along with this. But and it's very important, as long as I've come this far, as to say that on the cross, that in the garden here, this is the agony in the garden, they call it. What this was here was. You have to be in the unitive state here to understand this. But there will come a time when there's a fine line. I call it the fine line. Between the death of self, no self anymore, no person anymore. And I call it the line to be or not to be. Because by that time, when you have really lived this state to the end, as he did for, 33 years. It's a long time he lived in this state here. This is not some overnight little thing. God had become his sole experience of life. Remember we said earlier that author of that anonymous author, he said that there will come a time when what you think is your being, your whole experience of life, of being, of existence, is going to be God's. You know that this is God's being. That doesn't make you God. But I mean, this is your experience, your existence. That your whole experience of existence is God. This is God's existence. This is, your life is God's life. So, to be robbed of this isn't just to be robbed of your little person, who cares about that, but to be robbed of God's own life in you, to be robbed of your whole sense of being. It's no longer you at all, but you're also not going to have a sense of God's being. You're no longer going to be conscious of God. If you're not conscious of yourself, you cannot be conscious of God. There's no such thing as being conscious of God and not being conscious of yourself. Consciousness is reflexive no matter how you do it. People have tried to say, well, there is such a thing as a subject without an object, this kind of thing. But it doesn't exist. That's a fallacy. So, because if there's no object, there's no subject to an object. And if there's no object, there's no subject for the object. It works the same way. Cannot have subject without an object, ever. How can you have an object and no subject? And we're not talking about object to the senses. This is something I always try to make clear to people on my retreats. People mix up the object of consciousness being sensory objects. You know, like they're saying you have to be a one with the object. They're only talking about self. There's only one object of consciousness, and that's yourself. Nothing else. The trees, everything, these are objects of the senses. What you see, what you touch, what you hear, what you feel, these are objects of the senses. They are not objects of consciousness. So an object of consciousness is always yourself. And if you're one with God, well, it's you and God together here. Now, if you take away, if you stop that whole function of consciousness, that whole reflexive mechanism in there, you have no awareness of yourself or of God. But the senses go all right on seeing everything that they've ever seen in their whole lives, because they are not objects of consciousness. People mix these two up, the object of the senses and the object of consciousness. They're totally different, have nothing in common. So anyway, when he died and on the cross here, this was this to be or not to be in the garden. He wasn't afraid of death. He wasn't afraid of even physical suffering, because real suffering is interior suffering, has nothing to do with physical pain. So he thought he would lose this. And in doing that, he would lose his whole purpose for coming. I mean, it would all be over. This kind of thing. And he'd sweat it out. He actually sweat that out, that fine line between to be or not to be. If I cease to be, if they kill me, and I just cease, how can this, I have fulfilled anything? I've not had any mission. I've been a flunky, you might say, or whatever. He just had this, came upon this here. And God let him know, because you know what's on the other side of that line? Nobody knows. Nobody knows. A lot of people say, oh, well, I've met some people, and you talk about this fine line, they say, oh, I just jump right through. I go right over the line, because they think they're going to end up in the glory of God. They don't know anything about it. That's not the option. The option is to be or not to be. And it doesn't say what's going to be. Nothing. So what did Jesus say? He said, not my will. Well, of course, he couldn't have done anything about it anyway, to be honest with you. This was totally God's will. He had no say. And you knew that. But I can't tell you, I just cannot tell you what enormous trust in God that he had to say that. Whatever you want. If I cease to exist, so be it. If I was created to cease to exist, and this is it, fine. Because that's what you want. You created me to cease to exist someday. That's fine. That's your will. I'll go with it. And if it's all over, I'll go with it. And so you have to, and it's not hoping. You don't have that hope anymore, that there's going to be some good on the other side of the line. You don't know. This is all in God's hands. But you know what? If you lived your whole life with God, I mean really with God, I remember myself as saying, well, I'd just soon go to hell for God. If God sent me to hell, it wouldn't bother me at all. Because if this is God's will, I'm for that. Whatever, because, I so trusted God that everything that good would somehow, because I believe God was good, and somehow that's going to be okay, no matter what. And so if I cease to exist, well, if that's God's will, then that's what's best for me. That's what's okay. Didn't bother me a bit. So you can't have any fear. You have to have perfect trust, and I would say even perfect love of God, because That's trust. And you can't hope for anything else. And so he said, thy will be done, and he died. And on the cross, remember, he hollered for everybody to hear, which is so astounding. You would think you would keep it to yourself. But he would say, my God, why have you forsaken me? And so as God left him. All the fathers understood that God left him. God left the man. They believed that. Of course, Christians today think, oh, God just came right back in. Or that his soul left and just came right back. That's just not the resurrection. That's not the way it goes. Has nothing whatsoever to do with it. Nobody was more surprised at the resurrection than the man Jesus. And everybody else is going to be surprised. Because it has nothing to do with some dead body rising back to life. Nothing. It's a revelation. Resurrection is a revelation. And it's a revelation also, equally, of the incarnation. It's just, everything's absolutely perfectly clear. So as I say, Jesus died, but Christ rose. Jesus died, but Christ rose. And all the fathers, oh, I have so many nice quotes here. And they say that now you have perfect man. They all say Jesus was not deified or glorified until his death and his resurrection and ascension. He had not achieved the end for which he had been created until it was over. Things have to be over. And so it was after his death, his resurrection, and now we start this tremendous ascent into the whole glory of God. His whole transfiguration, the ultimate transformation here. Sure, Jesus became Christ. And this is what God intended from the beginning. And he's the model. I always say, however it went for Jesus, it's going to go for every one of us. Every one of us. That's the example. All are going to be transformed into that one Christ. We're not transformed into Jesus. Forget that. Into Christ, God's own human nature. And of course, some people say, well, Jesus was God's own human nature. No. Nobody's human nature is God's but God's. Doesn't belong to Jesus, doesn't belong to anybody. This is solely God's human nature. And you have to understand that that's what all are to be transformed into. That which was in the beginning, you might say, the Alpha, and now we have to go through that and we become this Omega. Christ is the Alpha and the Omega. And in between, everybody has to make this circle tour, you might say, of transformation. But the point I wanted to make here is that the self that died here, this is no ego self. You know, I can't tell you how many people have this puny view. On the cross, Jesus' self died. You know, his little ego self. That is so stupid. That is ridiculous. There wasn't some ego there. This is he didn't even have one to begin with. And now, this is why they call it not the death of Jesus, but strictly speaking, it's the death of Christ. Because what is Christ? Christ is your oneness with God, and that's what died here. It was that divine self, you might say. Some people think of God, I never did, but some people think of God as their true self. Have you ever heard that? You're looking for your true self, and God turns out to be your true self? Well, that died. That true self in you died. That was God going out of him. That was God leaving him. This was not some ego self. This was the divine self, if you're going to call it that. Now, I never thought God was my true self. And in fact, God was not Jesus' true self either. Jesus was a human person like everybody else, and he had his own self. And Christ is not the union of two selves or two persons. But now we have the union with his death and this going out here. Now we have a real hypostatic union here. This is the union in God of God's human nature with its own human nature, God's divine nature, one with man's human nature. It's not in man at all. Had nothing to do with the risen Christ. You can think, well, that's all right. We have to have our icons. You know, the human mind requires something to focus on, whether it's God you know, there's some religions that are, what do we call them, iconoclastic. They allow no pictures, you know, no statues, no nothing, drawings, I don't care, any kind. Maybe some symbols, have a few symbols. But now Christianity, though, we recognize, and God provided us, the human mind needs an icon. We need something that we can point on and relate to. And Jesus is the Christian icon. But always Jesus points to Christ, something bigger than the man Jesus. He's not pointing to himself. Always pointing to Christ, pointing to God, you might say. And we cannot have enough of this reminding that he was like us in all ways, including no sin to begin with. Of course, I doubt it. I don't know if he ever sinned or not. But the thing is, we can understand the need for an icon, and Christianity is justified in having this icon because we don't believe that Jesus is God. He was a human being. We're not worshiping a human being. We worship God in Christ. And this is not the man Jesus. So we can have our icons. Now, people who worship Jesus as God, this is called anthropolatry. No, it's anthropolatry. Anthropolatry, that's how I pronounce it. And that means the worship of a human being as if that human being were God, or worshiping God as if God was a human being. Well, this is, you know, pure paganism. This is, and Christianity from the earliest days, year 100, 100, going in there, were accused of worshiping a human being as God, accused of anthropolatry. And that had a lot to do with the fathers having this problem with Christ. How to present Christ as one individual being when Christ is not an individual being. Christ was one human being, the human Christ. But the divine Christ is not one being. The Logos is not one being. So how are you going to put one being together with one that is not a being and then refer to it as Christ? You can't do it. It's trying to make one out of two here. And they had a terrible problem because people did look at Christ, did look at Jesus. And, of course, you have to understand some of the earliest Christians were hardly out of polytheism. And for some reason, Christianity resolved a big problem for them, these polytheists. How God could be some ultimate, this whole philosophical one, the philosophers were not polytheists, how we could have this one, and yet this one became incarnate to give us this polytheistic God, you might say, to worship. And so that was somewhat their view, and the fathers were aware of this, that they needed this icon, and actually referred to it as God. Of course, they in their writings and everything else kept telling you otherwise, but even so, this is the tendency of the human mind. Polytheism is part and parcel, I think, of the human mind because it has to have something to focus on. And even those iconoclasts who are against all these, they have mental images in their own heads. You don't have to create some mental image out here. But the thing is, we are justified in having our Jesus as the icon of Christ because he's not God. As I've said, reference to God is not a reference to either Jesus or to Christ. Reference to Jesus, the man Jesus, is not a reference to Christ or to God. And the reference Christ is not a reference to either Jesus or God. Now think that over. We're talking about terminology here. Jesus is always the human being. God is God. And Christ is not just Jesus or some human being or God. Christ is the oneness, not of the man Jesus, he was a person, but of God in his own human nature, man's one common, universal human nature. Not God wasn't just one with one human being. There's no such thing as a particular human being. You know the philosophical saying, keep in mind, what is common to all is proper to none. What is common to all is particular to none. She's not any more particular human being than he is. There's no such thing as a particular human nature. It doesn't exist. As soon as you start talking about the particular, now you're talking about a person. You're talking about a particular human being that's a person. But there's no such thing as a particular human nature. Yours is no more particular than mine, or mine than yours, or this one from that one. You can't point out a particular human nature. It doesn't exist. Human nature is a common element. You have to understand it's a universal. And universals are not particulars. Person are particulars. And they're not really universals. Can't be, ever. So that's the particular. And I do a little thing in my book on the individual. Some people think that all you have to do is to be an individual person, an individual, because you are an individual being, that therefore that makes you an individual. I don't know that you can't be an individual human nature, but they tend to equate the two terms individual and person with each other. For them to be an individual means to be a person. And to some extent that's usually what it does. But in the, when we get down there, that's not what it means at all. One is universal and the other is particular. So they don't mean the same thing, individual. Aristotle referred to an individual as a numerical one. He said it is of the essence of human nature to be one. A numerical one. The essence of human nature. That's Aristotle. And as he said, you can have innumerable, you can add up, you can count heads, but you cannot count human nature. Because human nature is essential, its essence is one. I think that's very beautiful because the essence of God is one. And so you have one-on-one there. Christ is the essence of God's one divine nature with man's one human nature. And that's exactly what Christ is. So what else did we want to say about that? Going back to this idea that, this is Paul's, that whole idea has got to go, that only he was born without sin, and therefore because God was his father, and because he was born without sin, didn't have a human father. If he had had a human father, he'd have been sinful like the rest of us. And because he was born without sin, what that meant to Paul, now we're talking about Paul with his Jewish view, is that he came to restore man to his original sinless nature. That's why you get all this Adam business mixed up with Christ here. That Adam was created sinless, but he fell. And now to make up for that, now suddenly we have Christ coming and dying, and he put the two together to restore man's original sinless nature by baptism and by the sacraments and so forth. And that was Paul's take on it. That was his view. And it's a Judaic view. It was. Now, I think we've all changed because today we know that without the egg and the ovum, you're not going to get a human being. And God creates no individual soul with sin. It's impossible. We're all born just as beautiful and as our original nature as Adam. And the Father's view was that man's salvation was in his transformation. That's what we're all about. That our original nature, the fathers believed that man was created to be more than he is now. Let me state that again. Man is created to be more than he is now. They all believe this. And that was our transformation into Christ. They all believe that. We have to become that of which we were all created in the image of Christ to be Christ. And we have to become that image. Irenaeus has a beautiful quote on that. We have to become that image. We're all created the image of Christ. And some of the fathers believed that Christ, Christ would have been revealed to man whether man had sinned or not. Whether man had sinned or not. That had nothing to do with the revelation of Christ. And somebody put it beautifully. It was Duns Scotus. You know, he was the opposition of Thomas Aquinas. He was the Franciscan. And he said, he made a big deal out of this. He said man was created for Christ. Christ was not created for man. As if God created man and said, oh dear, he fell down, now I'm going to have to create this man or this Christ and everything to go rescue these people. You know, as if it was an afterthought. As if Christ was some afterthought. After God sat back and waited how man's going to behave, and then suddenly he's going to come up with this Christ business here. And Duns Scotus said definitely that we can, that human nature is potential to be assumed as Christ. I mean, that's its potential. Man's original nature, its whole potential, is to be transformed and to be Christ. This is Duns Scotus. And the early fathers also said this. That, in fact, Gregory Nazianzus, he made a big deal out of this. He thought it was pretty pompous, because people used to think, well, if I hadn't sinned, we wouldn't have Christ. You know, it's like Christ depends on your being a sinner. And after all, if you don't need if you haven't sinned or you don't think you're a sinner, well, who needs Christ? Well, that was my view as a kid. Nobody's going to convict me of sin. I mean, I didn't feel a need for Christ. I couldn't understand what he was all about. So I took a special revelation. Naturally, I always call that my conversion experience. Never in my life has Christ had a thing to do with sin. And I think, you know what I think, this pinning all this sin stuff on Christ? I think it's the greatest insult to Almighty God that man has ever made. If Christianity goes down the tubes, we can look back and say why. They have made it so offensive to God, pinning all this sin and all the horror. And, you know, that Christ had to come. That God was so mad and so angry that he had to send some man to die for him and this kind of thing. It is just a tremendous, it's all wrong. Man never really got the incarnation, never really understood it, so you might as well wipe it out. I mean, what can you do? He can go on with this, you know. I don't know where he's going after this. Well, there'll always be a few who do understand Christ. But that we pin all this sin on this and on this man and on Christ and on God and everything else. You know, it makes God a big, horrible, meanie ogre. It makes God an ogre. And I want to tell you something too. Christianity has no need of Christ because the Jews had absolute belief and faith that God forgave them and God saved them. God saved their eternal souls. They believed they were immortal. God saved their souls. Jesus believed that. He was Jewish. He believed God forgave sin. He didn't think it was up to him to forgive somebody. That's ridiculous. However, I think he did stress. He knew that all the Jews believed that God forgave sin. But I think what he stressed is that we have to learn to forgive one another. It's, you know, God has no problem forgiving. Nobody's more forgiving than God. Nobody wants to throw all that out in the trash more than God. But Jesus really stressed forgiving one another. You know, forget God having to forgive you. It's what man's really need is to really forgive one another. That's what we need. And I think that he stressed this fact. And something else here, I know Tim is the one who brought this up while we're on the subject, and there's so much to say about Christ, there's no end. He said, well, what about when Paul saw this blinding light? Paul never saw the man Jesus. And he saw this blinding light. Remember his conversion, he was knocked off his high horse. And he said, well, who are you? You know, I can't imagine him saying who to a light. If I was blinded by light, I wouldn't say who. I would say, what is this? Or maybe, what is this? But evidently he heard some voice in his head or someplace. And like saying, Paul, why? He heard a voice. He said, well, who's saying that? And that Jesus, or Christ, he heard the words anyway. Remember, God doesn't talk. But what he understood by this is that you're not persecuting Jesus. When you're persecuting others, you're persecuting Jesus. Now, what do you think that meant? When you persecute others, you're persecuting the man Jesus. What does that tell you? It's pretty obvious that there's only one human nature. You persecute one human being, you're persecuting everybody. There's only one human being. I'm not being, but one human nature. And if you persecute one, you're persecuting human nature really of everybody. And I think this really got Paul. See, he didn't think he was out to persecute Jesus, did he? No. The man was dead. He was out to get those who believed in the man Jesus. But he said, you persecute them. It's no different than persecuting me. Now, why are you running after somebody who's dead and everything like this? I mean, it's the same thing. There's only one human nature. So you're good to one person, you're good to human nature. And don't pay attention to who somebody is. That's totally irrelevant. It's what they are. You know, when a man in a street is dying or whatever, you don't ask who he is. It's what he is. He's a human being. We can forget all the who's. Man is so taken up with the hoo-hoos and the tutus that they forget that they're both the same human beings here. So what we need is more stress on what man is and human nature, and not who individual people are. That doesn't even concern God. God is not a respecter of persons. And nobody can tell you that better than I. God never respected me as a person. No, never. Never cared for me as a person. I learned as a little kid, God had a work to do in you and a subject. Didn't care what's going on in your life, what you like it, you don't like it, whether you go with it, you don't, too bad. And I thought, well, I'm never going to, no use me praying to God. What's use my praying to God? He knows what he's going to do, and he's going to do it. And I thought, well, I don't know what he's going to do. And of course, that's scary enough. But I thought, well, I've got Our Lady. And so Our Lady has always been with me. That's the only one I've ever prayed to. Well, I wouldn't pray to God for anything. The only time I ever turned to God to ask him for anything was suddenly he disappeared and left a great big black hole. That's all I was. Well, thanks. Thanks a lot. I never did it again. So, let me see where we want to go with this after this here. Okay. So revelation, Christ is the revelation of a great truth, namely man's eternal oneness with God. This eternal oneness is the truth and the mystery that we know and call Christ. I've already pointed out that this union, what we call hypostatic union, is beyond anything a man knows as oneness with God. Beyond what we think is a supernatural, mystical oneness. A hypostatic is a oneness in God. And also a hypostatic oneness with God is personless. Okay, that's something else. Those are two elements to stress on a hypostatic union. It's not a union with who you are. Are you with me? That's the person. There's no person here. It is personless. And the hypostatic is with the basic human nature, what you are, what man is, and what God is here. So the hypostatic union is personless. Now, of course, the fathers, in order to deify the man Jesus, wanted to make the Trinity. They tried to make the Trinity three persons. And this is a good time to bring this up. If you study theology or going to get into Christ or anything else, or the Trinity, sooner or later you're going to come across this excuse for the Christian Trinity being called Father and Son. It's just an excuse. And this is the term for this, namely Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is what they call the economic trinity. And who coined the word economic, oddly enough, is Irenaeus. Because already back there in the hundreds, there was this fussy business here, starting up of modalism and Sabellianism and that. And this, another term for the economic trinity, or what goes with it, is this term, have you ever heard of soteriology? Soteriology. S-O-T-E-R-I-O-L-O-G-Y. The word means salvation. And so therefore they're talking about what God revealed as the economy of salvation, how man is saved. Soteriology is a study or the presentation of how man is saved. And the reference there to Father and Son is reference to the economic trinity. It's not a reference to God immanent in itself. This is what they say God has revealed through, in the man Jesus or Christ as the way of man's salvation. And theology will, many of them anyway, what I have read, they will say this is all we are concerned about. We're not about making big declarations about God's immanent essence or existence and that. What Christianity is mainly concerned with is how God saves man. And they've got St. Paul's idea in here. This fitting the diagnosis to fit the cure, like Paul did. And so that's their excuse for, I see it as an excuse for calling God a Father and a Son. Now, where did this come from? Well, Jesus, of course, when he referred to his Father, he's referring to his natural biological father because of the incarnation. The Jewish reference to Father, God was a father too, and that was to the Creator and their personal rapport with God as their more spiritual father. And Jesus knew that, and he understood that perfectly. But so Jesus had a little different interpretation of it, though, because not only is God the Father of Israel, of all Jews, these are all God's children, you might say. God is a father in that sense. That's more metaphorical. Jesus really meant it in the real physical sense. God was his only father. So his reference to father was a little bit different, or quite a bit different than the normal Jewish understanding of God as a father here. And people got that. See, you can be the father of Israel and a spiritual father. But when somebody says that the Father and I are one, this goes beyond the Israeli or Jewish understanding of Father. When they say we're one. And that's where he was at. That's what he meant by Son. He meant one with the very essence of God here. One with God. And as I said, that's why he was killed. And that's because he affirmed and stuck up. And it was not Jewish. He was, in their eyes, a heretic and a blasphemer for saying that. But he knew that to be true. And so, now this is what happened. It is said, for the first 3 centuries of Christianity, all references to Father and Son were understood as references of the man Jesus to God as his biological father. So Father and Son had nothing to do with any Trinity. It was just Jesus' reference to God as his Father. And they used this. This was they started a fight over this business about the middle of the 200s and 50s or so. And this is going to take us from modalism and Sabellianism right into Arianism. You see, the Council of Nicaea in 325 was called to get rid of this whole modalistic idea of God and to get rid of Arianism. And Arian, this was the fight. They wanted to switch references to Father and Son to being the Logos of the transcendent. Are you with me what this means? A huge switch, as making suddenly you're going to go from the man Jesus to God as his Father in that respect, incarnation, to suddenly being the Son, being one of God's triune modes of existence, the Logos. They're making the Logos to be a Son of all things. And they're making Yahweh, of course, and to be the Father and keeping that one there. So there was a big fight over this. Huge, huge fight. But why did they want to do this? Why did they want to make that switch? To avoid anthropolatry. Because now you could say that that Son, this Jesus, is really, in his divinity, is the Logos. Are you with me? See, because now if you say the Son refers to the Logos, it's referring to God. It's not referring to the man Jesus anymore. This is referring to God. Where before the Son of God referred to Jesus, now the Son of God refers to the divine, eternal, uncreated Logos. So now you have a defense of anthropolatry. We do not worship as some man here. We, the Son of God, we are worshiping as God, the Logos. And God also as his Father. So they made this huge switch here. And they fought over it. Exile. Condemnations. You name it. They fought it out. And, you know, the question is, who is the one that won out? And I've often thought about these councils of the church here. If you study the history of it, it's shocking. There's absolutely nothing wonderful about any of these councils. You're lucky if you didn't have a riot. The way they got up there, you have to read it. I can't go into it. You're going to read it for amusement, not for admiration or anything uplifting you get out of it. There's disgusting. And there was such political power, now both with the ecclesiastics and also with the political people. You have to remember in that day, there was no separation of church and state. If there was any unrest in the church, well, there was unrest in the state. And the state had to take care of it, which is why all the emperors and that got in on this kind of thing, and the rulers. So, in fact, it was the emperor that, the emperor called all but one of the church councils. All of our church councils in the early centuries were called by the emperor. Only one little one was called by the church itself. So this was because it was caused so much unrest. And so who won at Nicaea? Of course, nobody won. I mean, there was nothing resolved there. In fact, it blew up. That church practically blew up after Nicaea. And so who pronounced this? Who made this switch here? They say, I'm not making this up, that all those representatives of the church there were so intimidated, they were coerced into signing this and to agreeing. Now, some may have done it out of peace, wanting just some peace. Others might have been afraid that they're going to lose their see. They were bishops, lose their position, be condemned, and everything else. So that's how a lot of things got passed in the church. And I know from Vatican II, not many years ago, that the Pope, John, he intersected a document written by the theologians, that a note saying this: pass it as it is. Pass this, whatever document it was there. But just pass it as it's written, because we will interpret it afterwards. Do you understand what that means? It said it broke John's heart. In other words, they went along with, a certain meaning and everything else here, and what they intended to say, and yet the theologians had it all mapped out ahead of time, that they knew exactly how they were going to propagate this and interpret it for us. Tell us what this is supposed to mean here. And so it doesn't really mean what it says. It means what we say it says here. And John interrupted it, but this is the way it goes. A lot of the fathers of the church, I think, went along with some of the, what I call the proverbial party line, giving it their own interpretation. You know, interpretation is a lot of things when it comes, even in church affairs. It's not just the Bible. But in everything, think of our American Constitution. Well, that's all to interpretation. It goes the same way with all these religious documents and synods and councils, the same way. It's how you interpret it. But anyway, they won out, and so Christianity has been stuck. I wouldn't call it with the Trinity. A Father and Son, there is no such thing as God's not a Father and a Son at all. And so in our creeds, our teaching, everything else, so we have no Trinity, really. We don't have any logos. We don't really have any transcendent. We've got an old man with the beard and the young man and the bird. That's what we've ended up with. But the excuse given, theological excuse, they're good at covering their tracks, the theologians. And, well, that only regards the what do they call it? Soteriological, or because it has to do with our salvation. That God's only Son became this, and they're going to say this. And that's another thing. God cannot become a human being. God cannot even get inside flesh. You cannot circumscribe God. God cannot be contained in anything. In fact, one of the fathers, he made a comment. He said, you try and put God inside a human being, that human being would blow up, just explode. God cannot be circumscribed in any human being. So God can be one, though, with a human being. But you're not going to get God underneath the flesh. And I think that there's a lot of thinking that in Christianity we had two major schools. Those first centuries could be divided into two major schools, at least starting with Nicaea. They call it the Alexandrian school of thought. This is just a school of thought. There's no such school as such, but this is how you could divide these fathers up. One side they called God flesh. That's the Alexandrian school. The others was the Antiochian school, and they believed God man. And what do you think the difference there was? The Antiochians thought that Jesus was a full, total human being. But while the Alexandrians admitted he had to have a soul, they barely give him lip service for having a human soul. He's mainly the flesh. He's mainly the flesh. That's what the term incarnate means to become flesh. So all that Christ is, as far as his human nature goes, is just flesh. And their whole theology is presented like that. And for the most part, I would say that Christianity, both sides, East and West, represent the Alexandrian school, for the most part. When they condemned Nestorius, who was the only person in the history of the church who got up and said Jesus was a full human person, they condemned him, sent him off. And anybody ever again in the history of Christianity, you find anybody after Nestorius, who was died in well before Chalcedon, either year. Anyway, Chalcedon is 451. Anyway, nobody, no theologian in the history of Christianity, either side, East or West, will ever dare tell you that Jesus was a human person. They're going to get the Nestorian treatment. Of course, today now, we've always had Nestorian churches, by the way. These people just up and left the rest of the church. That they will never dare say that Jesus was a human person. Never. They'll be condemned, shot down. All they do, what theology will do today, is tell you he was a personality. Well, how you can have a personality without a person? and how you can have see, all Nestorius did was ask Cyril. He asked Cyril. And Nestorius was a patriarch, the biggest next to the Pope. Patriarch of Constantinople. He had been a monk, just yanked out of his monastery to become patriarch overnight. And all he did was ask Cyril, how can you have a full human being that's not a person? And nobody has ever answered that question. Nobody. And they say for the next centuries, all the Middle Ages, everybody's trying to figure out how to answer that. How are you going to have a complete human being that's not a human person? So nobody's ever been able to answer Nestorius' question. However, Nestorius was a big representative of the Antiochian view. They all believed Jesus was a complete human person, just like ourselves. And, well, we can't go on more with that whole history of the church here, but it's very important to point out that this changed, this big switch that came about, understanding of the Trinity, as why and how it came about, to demonize, to do away with anthropolatry, and to demonize the man Jesus. Therefore it was changed, that Father and Son refer to the transcendent and the Logos, and was no longer just a reference to the man Jesus as a son. And God is his Father here. So that was one of the big switches. And then, of course, after that, we even go further, and then they're going to declare the whole Trinity three persons. Now, it's interesting. They never declared Jesus was a divine person. You can't do that, because that would have been denying that he was human. You cannot have a human nature that's a divine person. It's not going to work. So, but that what they did, what Cyril said, is God took the place of Jesus' person. Are you with me? God took the place and acted as Jesus' person for him. Jesus was not a human person, and he wasn't a divine person. But God, a divine person, acted as Jesus' human person. And what do we say person is? It's me, I am, self. That's my self-identity. And but it wasn't Jesus' human nature that was a person. And that was a divine person or a human person. And as I said in the book, can you imagine the Pope getting up on his balcony someday and saying, I want you all to understand that Jesus was never a human person and Jesus was never a divine person. He was no person. And this is Orthodox theology. I'm telling you, they would lock him up. They'd lock up the Pope for anything like that, and yet this is perfectly Orthodox. Jesus was not a divine person. Who was the divine person? The Logos. God was a divine person, not Jesus. He wasn't a divine person, and he was not a human person. Of course, nobody believes a thing like this. But when we talk about theology, it's a mess. Just a mess. And they were obviously very anxious to demonize Jesus, to avoid anthropolatry and this kind of thing. That's because Christ presents this kind of problem. You got to focus on somebody. As I said, everybody wants the mentality to be able to have a focus, an icon or something. And Jesus is a perfect icon of a human being that became Christ. A human being that's going to illustrate what man's life with God is like, his oneness with God, and what he can expect with his death. What happens to him when he dies is what's going to happen to all of us. We're all going to go the same way, with the resurrection, the ascension into the glory, transfiguration, transformation. And this is how it's going for all of us. And our resurrection is also going to be, we ourself will die. And God with us, and what's going to rise is Christ here. And that's when we're talking about the hypostatic union, which is not a union with God, such as a man knows it here. So, let's see. I want to see if there's anything else on this side of the paper. We want to bring his dual natures. Yeah, there's no crossing over the divide. Person differences. The locus of the oneness is in the Logos. Yeah, sometimes, just for the sake of clarifying this, there's the view. How to make Christ one, as I said, is the problem. How to make Christ one. Well, this is how they did it. They said Christ is the union of two natures in in the logos, in the hypostasis. You know, hypostasis means one of those distinctions in the divine essence. So they will say, and now what they did, when the West came up with the term, I think we've already gone over this, they came up with the term persona. They didn't like the term hypostasis. They fought over that. They didn't like the term hypostasis. That's the Greek term, to make these distinctions in the Trinity. And the West came up with the idea of persona. I think we've gone over this. Now, persona meant mask, and it sounded like modalism to the Eastern Church. So they refused to recognize that term persona. They never used it. For them, it did not mean hypostasis. But I'm telling you today, when you read the books of the early fathers, they're going to stick in the Western, when they translate them, they're not going to leave the fathers hypostasis. They're going to say person, which the fathers never used and never said. None of the Greeks. They could not use the term person or persona. They couldn't use it. So that was out for them. It's not in Chalcedon. They never used that term. And yet I had to look up many translations of Chalcedon in order to verify whether they had really used the term person. And I came across two that had none of it, that I trusted the most. They're by Greek authors. So they do not use that term person. What happened is that after in the 500s sometime, in the 500s, there was some meeting. It's in my notes. There was some meeting at some synod or other where the Eastern agreed with the West that what you mean by persona is what we mean by hypostasis. So therefore, after that, these were used as synonymous terms. Now that's the story on it. Now, but when you know what hypostasis means, and you know that whole background, it has nothing to do with the person. So whoever made that agreement is off track. Hypostasis does not mean the same as person. Never did, and it still doesn't. And yet, even the Eastern translations now are going to start giving you the term person. So when we say that Christ is the union of two natures in one hypostasis, that has been translated to Christ is a union of two natures in one person. Okay? Now, person works for people because person means an individual being. And that is tritheism. That's making the Logos an individual being. And it's wrong. It's wrong theology. It's not what the fathers believed, and yet that's what we're being given to understand and taught and everything else. That Christ is a union of divine and human natures in the person, in the Logos, in the person of the Logos, in the person of God. And you can say, well, what difference does it make if you say person? It makes all the difference in the world because of the way they have defined person. I'm telling you, the way they have defined person as a divine self, as a subject, as your self-identity, your true identity and everything else is a piece of Hinduism. They believe Almighty God is a self, a subject, consciousness. This is Hinduism. This is not Christianity. And no wonder all these people are going east to find Christ. They're not finding it in what we mean in Christianity. So when you make a Christ, but you have to understand their problem. They needed to present Christ as one being, one, because the human mind requires everything to be one, and Christ is not one. Christ is a oneness, not a one. And it's the oneness of man's human nature and God's divine nature. And to say it's in the hypostasis of the Logos, I'd go even further. I'd say it's this hypostatic union is with the whole Trinity. That's fine. If you want to put it in the logos, that's fine with me. Only I'm not a God flesh person. Christ, Jesus is more than just flesh. Man is more than flesh. And the logos is basically the one that, why they say he was incarnated, is because the logos is one with matter. And that's why they say incarnate. They always, all the theology, your liturgies, your books, your everything, they're always referring to Christ as a body. We're one body in Christ. We're going to be one body. And they're talking about all this being one body. It's whoever mentions his soul. I used to wonder as a kid, I used to think, well, maybe his soul is what's divine, because there's no mention of Jesus with a human soul. I mean, the fathers couldn't tackle it, couldn't handle it. In fact, Apollinaris is the one who said God took the place of his soul. This is one of their Christology. And he's a very holy man, Apollinaris, really loved God. He hated to say Jesus had a human soul because he said the soul can be so rotten. His view of the soul was pretty corrupt and rotten. So and he didn't want that to touch. He didn't want that to touch Christ. They had their beautiful reasons. All of them were beautiful, beautiful men, except Cyril. He was a monster. As far as people were concerned, he was the incarnation of the devil. That was him. But he's the one who came up with what I call the ace in the hole. He is the one who said, this was not Jesus' human nature. This was God's own human nature. And what people said, what's the difference between Jesus' human nature being God's human nature? Because that belonged to Jesus. He was a person. And God created no person that did not belong to Jesus. And this had to come and be transformed into being God's. We can say everything belongs to God as far as that goes. Everything created belongs to God. But we're talking about this specific hypostatic union here. And Jesus, his human nature was his particular human nature. And God's human nature is no particular human nature. It's just man's one common human nature. So the minute you say that this is God's human nature, or that's God's human nature here, there, wherever you're going to go, you're off course. That's not it. There's no such thing as a particular human nature. So, I personally, speaking for myself, now Cyril's the one who refused to make any difference. He said, as soon as you divide up Jesus and God, then you have, he said, you ruin the unity. We've got to stress the unity. That's what the Alexandrians, the God-flesh school, they stress that unity. Whereas the Antiochian school, they stressed the duality. That was a particular stress here of either side. Of course, the Antiochians certainly believed that just as much as the others, that God was totally one with a total human nature. But they're stressing the unity over words. This is the problem that happened there. When you stress the unity of Christ as one, which is what this was their whole problem, trying to make Christ one being. When you stress the unity, you come up with monophysitism. And I want to tell you what that is. Cyril was a monophysist because he refused to allow the dual natures. He recognized them, but he said after the duality of natures, they're oneness. Even those two natures, nevertheless, when you come together, it was like the divine so overwhelmed the human that Christ is really one divine nature. That's what monophysitism is. That Christ had one divine nature. That's the definition of monophysitism. And I say for the most part, that is what every Christian believes. That apart from his appearance and that, Christ was just one divine person, one divine individual. Yeah, sure he had flesh, but I mean that also disappeared. So This is my view of what most Christians believe. Most Christians do not divide up Christ into this divine and human. They don't get that. They're making this man Jesus one divine nature, one divine person, and as soon as you make God a divine person, and Christ is the union of two natures in a divine person, you're going to get one divine person with one divine nature. And so and one divine being. So you're going to get Christ looked upon as supposed to be one divine being, which is not Christ. You have one divine nature, which is not Christ. And you have one divine person, which is not Christ. The divine person is supposed to be the Logos. And there is no divine being, period. The Trinity is not three beings. So there's no divine being to speak of. You have a human being. And then, of course, you have the two natures, and you don't have one divine nature. There's a human nature and a divine nature. So, but it's the oneness that really is Christ. Only you have to have the right definition of Christ. This isn't just a being. This is not a one being. That union does not constitute a one being. And this was the Father's problem with Christ. And so, when you understand this, if anybody has a problem with Christ, figuring Christ out, that's why it was a problem for the fathers. Huge. And it's never been resolved. Not to this day. To say it, to think you can just eliminate all these problems and say, oh, well, he was Jesus. No, that's not Christ. Now you get the Jesus cult. That's worship a human being at all. That's God. That's not what God revealed. This is not Christ. So, what do we have coming up here? Okay. Yeah, the incarnation was really God's way of revealing Christ. Remember, Christ was always in the plan. And this incarnation, what we call the incarnation, he was an instrument. Jesus was, this man was used as the instrument for revealing Christ to man. And in the incarnation, God gave us a concrete human example, not only of his oneness with mankind, but of our life's journey leads to the same eternal oneness that we know as Christ. It's an example for all of us. No one better defined the Christian goal as Saint Irenaeus. On account of his infinite love, he became what we are, in order that he might make us what he himself is. He also adds to this that we have to be transformed we have to become that of which we are an image. And I think I'll stop now and try and clear my throat. And when we come back, we'll start there with the image of God, what they meant by the image of God. Okay? Thanks. There's two views here of the Irenaeus had this view. He took, when Paul referred to Christ as the sum of creation, you have to understand that, I don't know if Paul got this from the Stoics or not, but the fact that man is a microcosm of all of creation. Irenaeus took this view, and he talks about Christ. How did he put that? In the process of being incarnated, in the process of God's taking on human nature, God united itself, recapitulated. You know what that means? Go over, repeat, kind of repeat something. Recapitulated the whole history of creation. Uniting itself to the elements and to the molecules and the atoms and you just keep going on up the scale. And it's a very beautiful view, his understanding of the incarnation as God recapitulating the whole of creation. And that's, that ends with man. because man is a microcosm. And this is what it took in the incarnation to do this. And this is a beautiful view of it. And I also have the view that what we are called to do with this revelation of Christ is to recapitulate this whole incarnate. Of course, the fathers themselves talk about us recapitulating incarnation and our transformation. They talk about that too. But my view was that we are called upon to recapitulate Christ's own humanity, his own life on this earth. Or, and as far as I'm concerned, Jesus' life with God. We have to recapitulate his spiritual life. Now, we cannot recapitulate, his thoughts, his ideas, and the person. What makes for differentiation is the person. We cannot recapitulate any of that. But his life with God, this came to me pretty early on in life. This is nothing recent. That I've often said, when we catch up to that, come into that unitive state, we have caught up with the incarnate Christ on earth. This was Jesus's experience of God on this earth. And then he went out and, first of all, he lived this totally unknown. Most people in the unitive state live totally unknown. They don't go around telling people I'm in a unitive state. If I know my mother was in that state when I was born. If I had told her she was in a unitive state, what they call unitive state, she would just poo-poo the whole thing. She wasn't into any of this spirituality, didn't know a thing about it. And if I had said, oh, you reached that state that St. Teresa talks about, and it meant nothing to my mother. And she knew God within. Wow. I tell you, that she was God talking, as far as she was concerned. But, she said, God gave me to know. She would always say that. God gave me everything I need to know. And she said, the one thing God didn't give me to know was you, she pointed to me. She said, I understand your father, who's the most complicated human being ever lived. And I understand your brothers and sisters. I understand other people. She said, I've never understood you. It used to bother me here saying that. I said, why bother? I don't think we ever understand other people at all, but that was her view. God didn't give her an understanding. But anyway, so we have to recapitulate Jesus' spiritual life with God and recapitulate going through our whole lives, totally unknown to anybody else. And because it's our daily life, it's our ordinary life. And if God has something special for us, God will make that known. It's not up to us. I often wonder about these people. They feel, in fact, the church will tell you this. After you've reached this unitive state, what comes next is you are given some apostolic mission by God to go do something, for the church. That you have to get out and be this big missionary or do something, for God. Now you got to do something. I remember some Jesuits, I knew some friends, and they knew I was in that unitive state, and they said, well, now what are you doing for God? You're doing nothing. Well, it's true. I never felt any mission in my life. I don't buy any of that stuff. But if God has something that for us to do, or how can I say it? I was very much at home, just with my kids, just living with God. That was a good life. That's a good life. Just living it out with God. I can't think of a better life. And so there's no sense of a mission or anything else. Nevertheless, Christ, unknown, really, I don't think Jesus chose it. But when he was outed, you might say, by John the Baptist, about him being this great person and baptizing in the Spirit and this kind of thing. And I don't know that Jesus baptized anybody. But this was in the Spirit. This is just not with water. And so now he's known. And now he's headed down. He's because of all the miracles that that God did on his behalf. And of course, he only lasted 3 short years of being known. Imagine somebody in this world known for only 3 years. And here we are the whole world's heard about Jesus now, or ever since he died. I mean, that's been spread all over the place. Whether they believe it or not doesn't make any difference. Everybody's very acquainted with this one historic person here. But when we're called to recapitulate this, once we arrive here, the rest of our life, it goes exactly like Jesus's. And this death on the cross, we go through that. That's that whole divine self that goes out. And this resurrection and the ascension. This is the way it goes for every human being. That's the revelation of Christ, that all become Christ. So we recapitulate his spiritual journey, his interior journey. As I said, we don't. What we ask for is Jesus's love of God. We don't love Jesus. What we want is his love of God. Well, you can love Jesus too, as far as that goes. But what we want is his enormous love of God, his enormous trust, his faith. We want his faith, his trust, his love of God, his guts. Whatever this is, I mean, the best thing in him, we have to find that and recapitulate that in ourselves. It's not that we're looking to some man to do this for us, but he was a tremendous example of how we are supposed to have our faith in God. You don't put your faith in anybody, but only God. You don't love anybody. Well, you can love everybody in that sense. But I mean, this is the whole love of your life is Almighty God. It's focused there. You don't trust other people in your life. You really trust God for this. And that's where he was. And we have to recapitulate that as the great example for us, the model. But so people, when they think that he himself was Christ, well, we have no indication that he ever understood Christ. And this is what he said, though. When Peter declared him to be the Christ, Peter's the only one, apart from, I think, it's Pilate that asked him, "Are you the Son of God?" Something like that, and which he could not deny that. He said, Peter, flesh and blood, you're not get it from flesh and blood. By seeing me, flesh and blood, you're not going to understand Christ. By you yourself, as your own flesh and blood, that's not going to give you Christ. What did he say? Only God can reveal this to you. Christ can only be revealed. It's not by seeing, not by looking, not by trying to intellectualize or theorize or pretend or seeing it the wrong way. You have to wait till Christ is revealed to you. And that's why when Paul said, no longer I, but Christ lives in me. This was a recognition that his oneness with God, that is Christ. Paul knew that. I think he knew it from the beginning, but now he had realized that. This was a revelation to him. It really is no longer I that lives, but it's really Christ. And so we have to become that to some extent. Even coming here, we could say no longer I live, but Christ. If you understand Christ, though. Now, if you think Christ is one individual being, you'll never get it. You can't get it. But if you just leave the open door there, and God will reveal, hey, your oneness with God, that's Christ. That is Christ. That's not some other person. That is not some other being. This is certainly not the man Jesus. It's your oneness. And that's a mystery. When you really think about that, your oneness with God, that's Christ. And isn't that a mystery to you? That your oneness with God, that's Christ. But you can't point to it, can you? Christ cannot be an object to you, ever. If Christ is an object to you, and you think that you can focus on this object, you don't know Christ. Because Christ is a oneness, not an object. The oneness of your human nature with God. And it's not something you're going to be able to point to, ever. Just like the Logos, you cannot point to the Logos. But this can be revealed to you. So that's the mystery. If you point to somebody, there's no mystery. And so he's it. That's so big deal. But you cannot point to this mystery that is Christ. So that's a fundamental mystery. And you know what people do, unfortunately? When they made the Logos a person, now the term person has the same definition for a human person as for a divine person. They're defined the same way. We have no other definition for a divine person than that of a human person. Your self-identity, subject, I am, all that stuff. It's the same definition, one. So when they say that the Logos is a person, a divine person, people immediately think of an individual being, a being, put it that way. That's why I'm so against the notion of person, because God is not, the Trinity is not three beings. And so, but when you say that Christ is one person here, everybody thinks of Jesus, don't they? When you talk about Christ and as this one wonderful person of Christ, everybody thinks of the man Jesus. And yet theology says he was not a divine person. So what do people doing here? What are people really doing here? All you do to get a divine person is capitalize the P in the letter in the word person. That's all theology does. They'll tell you it's all transcendent. It doesn't mean a human person. They'll tell you that. Well, if it's not, then don't use the word person. Get another word. If it's not that. If it's not how you define it, then don't call it that. You know, they'll say to you, I figured this out here, say theology says to you, you have to remove all your notions of human persons when you think of God. And theologians will tell us to do this. Erase from your mind all your understanding of person. And because you can't, because God's not a human person. Don't think of God as a human being. Okay, so you erase from your mind all notion of person. And what's left? Nothing. Now, where do you go? You have no other way of thinking of God as a person other than as a human person. And just calling him and saying, well, this is a transcendental person, well, what difference does that make? And let me ask you this. Since the belief is, this is Orthodox belief, that the Logos as a divine self, person, I am, took the place of Jesus' person. Jesus was no human person. Throw him out as a human person. He wasn't a human person at all. He wasn't a me, myself, or I, or self-identity at all. He was a divine person. Therefore, everything he said, I am, I think, I walk, I eat, I die, I suffer. This is all God doing this, you see. Now, if God can take the place of a human person, then how is God not a human person? That's the question I would like to ask the theologian. If God can act and perform and be a human person, even though God is not a human person, are you trying? I hope I'm trying to get this across to you. They say Christ is not that God is not a human person, and yet they will tell you the theology is that God took the place of a human person, acted as a human person. Well, how does this not make God a human person? You see, I'm trying to trace down how we got to this Jesus cult. That the whole focus that Christ is Jesus, that Christ is God, that Jesus is God. It's all wrong. And theology they don't deal with it. They circumvent it. And one of the ways they circumvent it, have you ever heard, I have a whole chapter on this in the book. Have you ever heard, this is the big, I call this the big theological conspiracy. It's called the communication of properties. Sometimes it's communicatio idiomatum. This means because the Logos is just one divine person, because Christ is just one divine person, therefore, in two natures, you got one person here, and say this is one person with two natures there. Anything that you say about this person or pardon me, about these natures here. You can say it about that one person. So you can say God is glorious, omniscient, and everything else. This is all said about the one person. And then on the other side of the coin, you can say, oh, well, God suffered and died and was born and did this and did that, and it all belongs to the one person. Are you with me? To see how this works? This is called the communication of properties. Therefore, you can say anything that belongs to his human nature belongs to a divine person. And anything that belongs to the divine nature belongs to this one person here. That's called the communication of properties. Now, what's the matter with it? Well, everything. To begin with, we have to understand the true nature of God. The belief, monotheism believes that God is unchangeable, immutable, impassible. Impassible, that's the big term. And among other things, you just can't, God is God and that's it. There are no changes and moving around and can't be other than and so forth. So the term impassible, this is huge. This is huge in Christianity and for an understanding of God and of Christ. But the term impassible means cannot, let's just put it, feel and no emotions, no feeling. Now this was a big term for the Stoics. No movement inside of you. This is totally the belief of all the fathers, absolutely, that God is impassible. God cannot have the human experience. God does not go through any human experience because man is passible. He's always in change. His feelings, his emotions, everything about man is changing. And God is not. God does not change at all. And God does not go through all this human experience. Can't. Because God is impassible. So therefore, the whole communication of properties, this communicatio idiotum, or whatever it is, they call it an idiom. You know what an idiom is? This communicatio, you all know what an idiom is. It's a way of speaking. It's terminology. It's a way of speaking. So, so you can say that God was born and suffered and died. But in reality, God is impassible and can't do any of those things. But you can say it because we're talking about supposedly one person. But as a person, God is impassible. This is the belief. And this is the truth. God can't have the human experience at all. You might say God's human nature had this experience, all these experiences. And that was the experience of Jesus. And that was the experience that the Antiochans believed in. He had the whole experience. He's the one who died. He suffered. He was born. And the Alexandrians didn't like that. They had to make him God that suffered and died and was born and this kind of thing. So, so that communication of properties, you people have no idea that this is what we call the proverbial Christian party line is full of it. That's what it is. Jesus, born and begotten by God. Jesus is God. This is the communication of properties. They're going to justify it. You know, theology backs it up here. We're going to back it up by that. Whereas God was never born. God never suffered. And God cannot die or walk around or anything else. God can certainly do the miracles, which he did. And it wasn't human nature can't do miracles, but God did it. So this is you know, my tracing down where they get the Jesus cult, the communication of properties, the changing of the notion of son to something divine, making God a person. All these things were all to solve the problem of Christ as one being that people could focus on. And Christ can never be a focus. And you can never be one with Christ. You can only be Christ. You cannot be one. Christ is the union of human nature with man. And you can't be one with somebody else's human nature because it doesn't exist. You cannot be one with what you are already. You're a human being. How can you be one with God's God's human nature? Because you're already a human being. You can't be one with what you are already. And you cannot be one with what you are going to be. So when we get to the Eucharist, we'll find out that that's the only place. That's the only thing you could ever point to and say that is Christ. You could point to the host and the wine, and you could say, yes, well, now we have Christ here with us. This is Christ with us. This is this eternal deified. The man Jesus is dead. I remember talking to a monk, and he read something. I did this little, what was that Buddhist thing where you do the ox pictures, you know? Somebody asked me to do that in Christian. And I asked this monk, I said, what do you think of that? He said, well, there's no Jesus in here. And I said, well, he died. Well, he just flipped out. He just flipped out. He's dead. The man, for me, that man doesn't exist at all. And but he just never could see Jesus dying because the belief is the man that died just rose. He's the same. That resurrection just restores what you were. It doesn't make you more than you are or whatever. It doesn't change you. Not really. Now you can't sin. That's about it. That has nothing to do with resurrection or death. You have to understand that person died. That person, Jesus, died. And I forgot now what I was going to say here about carrying on with that. Well, anyway. About you cannot be one with Christ. You can only be Christ. But this has to be revealed, as I say. If people, it's not a matter of belief. In fact, I would recommend that people don't believe anything that I say. You think it over yourself, but then don't necessarily believe what other people say either. We have to get beyond our beliefs. We have to get outside this proverbial Christian party line, because that's all what I call, in the box. You have to learn to think outside the box. You have to not have the fear. A lot of people are afraid to do that. I've got to tell you, they're afraid they're going to lose their faith. They're going to lose something. And, well, maybe you better lose everything. Those who give their whole life to God, they think they're going to save themselves or save their life. They're not going to do it. You can't. They're fools. But they think they can give themselves to God. It's like people who are going to have their cake and eat it too. And give themselves to God, but then they think they're just going to have a better self. They're going to give their lives to God, and they're going to retain their own life, and it's just going to be a better life. They don't realize they're going to wipe it out. God's going to wipe it out. You give it to God, and if God can do things, you would be surprised. So, as I said, we can only know as much as Christ as we have been transformed into Christ. We only know that much. There's no knowing Christ, the fullness of Christ, ahead of time. How can you? It's what you are to become. You cannot know it ahead of time. You do not know ahead of time what you're to be transformed into. You can call it Christ, but you don't really know exactly what that is. How that's going to go. How that's going to really end up here. And thus the fullness of Christ can only be known at the end of our journey. Until then, all we know is about Christ, which is what I'm talking to you, just about it. What we have heard and read, our ideas and images maybe, it is because Christ cannot be grasped by either the senses or the intellect, that Christ is a mystery that God alone can reveal. Though many think they know Christ in truth, they know him not. And that's what we have to be careful of. Claiming that we know all this, and it's all wrong. And this is, I just had a little excerpts on here from Meister Eckhart. He was keen on this whole thing. He said, human nature, this is a quote, human nature and person are not the same thing. The eternal Logos did not take upon itself this man or that man. This is right out of the Fathers. But took upon itself one free, indivisible human nature. Thus God donned man's human nature only, not an individual man. This is a carryover from all the Fathers. Now, Eckhart is already in the Middle Ages here. He was raised in Thomas Aquinas, the old Dominican here. Now, this is his view. Of course, people think that this is all very mystical, you know. They're talking about Eckhart being some mystical, speculative mystic or something like that. But you know, the true definition of, one definition, I got to tell you what one priest told me about the theological definition of mysticism is that the word begins in a mist and ends in schism. I think that's a good one, you know. But I have my own view of this so-called mysticism. Yeah, I'm kind of anti that whole thing. It's when you come upon the truth of something, and other people don't have that truth, or they think it's something else. See, people will say, well, what you've come upon, I mean, it just seems so exalted or beyond what you thought it was anyway, that they call this mystical knowledge. Where all it is you're telling people the truth, and they're the ones who had it wrong. Just because somebody's going to get it right, well, they think that, that's really been labeled some piece of mystical knowledge here. And like the early Fathers were considered quite mystical with what they came up on with. And they weren't mystical. They were giving you the truth. They were saying it like it is. This was the correct understanding of Christ. There's nothing mystical about it. But to people who don't have it right, it sounds very mystical. And that's my view of mysticism. They just have something right. Authentic mysticism, what I would say. Something who really knows that revelation of God. That they're just saying the truth. Just saying the truth. And people tend to think, that's all very mystical, and it's not. There's nothing mystical about it. They've got to correct their own views. They've got to get it right. And then that's just as mystical as... You can erase the whole term mystical. We're just out for the truth. That's all we want is the truth. We don't want to believe this and that. It'd be a terrible thing to get to the end of your life and suddenly realize you never knew the Trinity, you never really knew God, you never really knew Christ. I can't think of anything worse in life than coming to the end and suddenly realize you never knew the truth of these things. I personally couldn't imagine that. That's why as a child I refused to believe that whole party line, because I thought, if I believe this, I can't. Well, first of all, you cannot force belief. You can't force it. And I just couldn't make head or tails out of that. I could never believe that. And it did occur to me that, you could spend your whole life believing this and that and the other thing, hanging on to it, going out pronouncing it and convincing yourself it's true and everything. It turned out that none of it's the truth. Can you think of anything worse than living your whole life on something that's really not the truth? Well, I think so. I think that's terrible. Then I once wrote a book on the fallacy of incarnation, the fallacy of reincarnation, because I thought it was so terrible that people spend their lives and have done so for centuries planning on being reincarnated when it's not going to happen. It's never happened. It's a lie. It's false. There's no such thing as reincarnation. And that's why I wrote the book, to make a case against that. It's crazy. And but can you imagine? People do go through their whole lives planning on that. They base their life on that. I once talked to an Indian man, and I said, I don't believe in any of that stuff. He said, he was too shocked for words. He couldn't imagine anybody that did not believe in reincarnation. And he said, without reincarnation, my life has no purpose. He said, reincarnation explains everything in my life. And without reincarnation, I would have no explanation for, even why I'm here, what I'm doing, and what I have to do in life, and anything else. It explains everything to him. Yeah, it would talk about a cop-out. It's a cop-out. You say, I'm here, I'm doing this because, that's my karma. That's, it's a cop-out. And they've totally aborted the spiritual journey. They have no spiritual journey. They're just to live out and try and get a better karma. And of course, all those who believe, and I've read the books, and they believe that they are reincarnated. In order to become an enlightened being, you have to be reincarnated, I think, 1,000 or more times. So don't plan on it. I met somebody once, and she said, well, we figured out that I'm on my 300th reincarnation, but my husband's on his 780, which made him superior to her. Can you believe how this goes? See, because he was closer to the truth, closer to coming to the truth. He knew more of the truth than she did, because he had been reincarnated many more times. So he was close to getting there. The whole thing is just, I could go on and on about that. Then, we don't want to get in there here. Resurrection just put an end to that whole fallacy. No. God doesn't have to need things like that. God can, some people say, well, does this mean that every man is saved? If it were all to be transformed, that was the motto of all the fathers. Salvation is transformation. That's what it resides in. God can forgive sin, and God's going to save us, no problem. But how does this work? It's all a matter of being transformed. And boy, now that left me the point that I wanted to make. Well, sometimes it just comes back here in a minute or two. Becoming more than he is. Let me see. Yeah, this is something that I also want to bring out. I found this very important anyway. And that's when we recapitulate the life, when we recapitulate Jesus' experiences of God, and he had many different experiences of God. Let's face it, he was in the know. When we recapitulate his life, this is what has surprised me in my own spiritual life, that at certain points of my own spiritual life, suddenly there would be Christ. And it was like saying, that verified my experience. Are you with me? That verified my experience. Suddenly I understood it. Suddenly I understood my experience, where I was, what was going on, how to look at it, how to understand it. So Christ, that whole revelation there, was the sudden appearing of Christ out of the blue. This verified where I was at in my experiences. Then what happens? In turn, you turn around and verify Christ. Do you see how this works? That Christ verifies your experiences of God, and you in turn verify this wonderful, great mystery God reveals as Christ. So it works both ways. This recapitulation of Christ's life, everything that we go through really in life, even before this, is going to verify. Christ will be there to verify our human experiences. That's what Christ is about too, to verify our human experiences. And we in turn, once we see that and can relate and identify that with Christ, then we verify Christ too. We die for the same thing. We die to say, we know Christ, the truth of it, what it is. And we verify Christ in turn. So this is how it goes. His human life and experiences verify our own. Thus, we recapitulate his own human spiritual experiences. And as verifier, Christ follows us, and in turn we follow, and we verify Christ. That's something else that I discovered too. I never followed Christ. Well, of course, I never followed Jesus, but I never followed Christ. Instead, I found out Christ followed me. And I'll tell you how this works. You have to go through all this stuff in your life with God. Just in your life with God. You have to go through all this. You don't know what Jesus' experiences were or Christ's experiences were. You don't know any of this. All you know are your own experiences with God here. So you, when you go, you have to go through this yourself. And then, suddenly, then there is Christ. So do you understand how Christ follows us? Christ follows us. Because we don't know how to follow Christ. We don't know how to follow. We don't know the way. We think we do. But as we map it out for ourselves, that's not it. God has the way. Christ is the way. But we just have to live our life as deeply as we can with God, as much as we can with God. And at some point there's going to be Christ there, revealed to us. And thus you suddenly see your whole life, you see everything come together in the light of Christ. It's truly wonderful. And therefore, you have to arrive at a certain point in your life before there can be Christ. So Christ follows you in that respect, namely to wait till you get here to verify itself as Christ, to verify that you're being transformed into Christ. So Christ, as I say, follows us. We have to be out there first, take all the risks, do our own thing. We can't stand back and say, oh, now I want to do it just like he did or anybody else did. You know, we don't have any gurus. I've often told people, in fact, I heard the other day from somebody who said, you know, a long time ago you told us that people who follow gurus are spiritually retarded. I mean that. Forget their spiritual life. Anybody who tries to follow another human being and do what they say and listen to what they say and hang on them, the whole thing is, totally misplaced. They're never going to make spiritual life. She said, I suddenly realized after like 10 years that that's true. She said, I was not willing to admit that my following this guy, my doing everything he said, you know, I was not able to admit that it didn't do me some good, that I didn't benefit by this. It's like telling me I'd wasted 10 years of my life. And she said, I couldn't accept that at all. But she said, I want to tell you now, you know, another 10 years later. And her knowing now, and knowing God and Christ, and coming into this whole thing here, she had not been a Christian before that time. She said, now I know that that's true. Now I know that that's true. You cannot follow somebody else. Your God is the, call it the Holy Spirit or whatever, that's our only guru. God is. God will let us know everything. Do not depend on somebody else. As you know, I have a friend, and anything I say he agrees with. Well, it's pretty, you know, it's no fun to be around somebody that agrees with you. And, well, I like, you know, somebody to, I'd rather be with somebody who totally disagree and totally disbelieve, sort of hated you even. I don't care. I'd like to be with that person. But somebody else who's going to hang on every word. You know, they're, what do they call, sycophants? Something like that. I'm very concerned for them. I'm very concerned for them. That what they're doing is living off my experiences. And this is called vicarious living. Are you with me? Living vicarious. You think you understand it. You think you got it. What they went through to get this information, now you got it quick. You know, you got it. You've been fixed. And so now you're all set up. You're ahead now because you got this all down there. And you know what? They haven't made 1 ounce of progress in their own life. And so that, I blame anybody who sets them up for a guru. I say they're fakes. Because they know that that's not the way. It's not the way they did it. I don't know these gurus following gurus. I don't understand that whole thing. But I'm saying anybody who thinks that picking up the information and that somebody else is going to give it to you, just dismiss all that. It's okay for people to inspire you for a few minutes and give you some thoughts. I have no problem with that. And certainly there are holy people around that it's nice to say hello to, maybe. I don't know anything about that. But the thing is, you, to follow somebody else, God alone knows the way. God alone knows the way, and God's going to lead you that way, and you leave it to God. Don't plan on anybody else telling you because it's not going to do any good. And that's just hearing about something. But we're looking for that whole immediacy of our own experiential life. That's the only place you can look for it. Don't look outside of it. So whatever, that's the whole problem with the mystics, you know. Reading all these books on the mystics and everything else, I think it's a bummer for people because they expect to have their experiences. And you know, these people, even who follow gurus, they expect to have their guru's experience. It's not going to happen like that. That's not the way it goes. So people are living with false expectations. There's just so much false in the spiritual life. I don't understand, you know, the people even start out on it if they knew the truth. It's tough. But you can't do anything by yourself. God's the one who does it. God does all the transforming. We do what we can to live our lives with God, and the rest of it's really up to God. So let me see if I have anything missed here on this paper. Oh yeah, about the image. I wanted to bring up this image business. I think I already, you got to stop me if I've already talked about this. The fathers believed that we were all created in the image of Christ and that we had to become that image. As Maximus the Confessor tells us that if the day we have become that image, that the mirror is broken. You no longer can see that image of yourself at all. And when you can't see an image of yourself at all, there's nobody there. So, this is what they mean. Now, I wish I had this book. I got to look through here. Later on, I'll bring you some beautiful quotes here. Maximus has some beautiful quotes on this. And what he said, it was really cute. They, you know, based on this notion of person here, I don't know that Maximus used the person. Instead, I think he used hypostasis. And since the belief was that Jesus was not a human person, he says it in the end for all of us. What happens is that our person goes. He says it's the law. He says outright, it's the loss of your individual self. This is all self-identity is gone in the end. And God substitutes its own self-identity, you might say. Well, I hope he didn't mean I am and all that business. But he's saying that there is that substitution there, whereby you're no longer yourself, but you're also no longer God. How could you be God if there were no self to be God? Impossible. How could you be God when there's no you? How could you be Christ when Christ is no particular you? As soon as you say you got a particular person. That's why Cyril was against referring to Jesus' human nature as God's human nature, because that makes Jesus a human person, but God's human nature didn't belong to any human person. He wanted to make absolutely certain of that, and that part of his is okay. So that it's just, and of course, he had a different ending for it. You know, sometimes there's being right for the wrong reasons, and so was Cyril there. So it was not really Jesus' human nature; it was solely God's. And so God's human nature is personless. So how can you point to that, or point to this Christ and as a person? It's, as I say, it's the essence of human nature is one. So therefore, Christ is a union with the totality of man's essential, eternal, one human nature that God created. And not the human nature of this particular man or that particular being. This was the Father's understanding. And if it had remained that, we would not have this view today, that only one man in all creation is one with God. Does that make any sense to you? Why would God bother to reveal a thing like that? What's that to us? So he's good, so he's one with God. You know, good for him. This is it doesn't make any sense at all. No, this whole revelation of the incarnation, it's huge. It's huge. Its effect on the world is still in the process of going on. See, I'm hoping that in the end it will get to their understanding that there's no reincarnation. We've come quite a ways, though, with that. In some paper, one paper I have, I listed a lot of the things that the incarnations already had an impact in the world. Not directly, but our whole view of man has somewhat changed. We have a whole lot of different, what else I think that came, it doesn't come to mind now, this list. But this has caused, and it should cause reincarnation to go down the tubes, if we really understand this is part and parcel of the revelation of the incarnation. Oh, there's so much that it means to the world. It is meant for everybody. This was not meant for Jew or Gentile, this is every human being that's ever lived. So now I think what we'll do here, I have down here the events of Christ's life, his experiences, or our revelation. For example, well, here we go. We don't want to get into well, maybe we should, I don't know. This was this kenosis business. This is something. His experiences are our experiences, born into an egoless, unitive state about this kenosis, emptying of ourself. These are indirect experiences we can recognize in our own life. The unitive state, the kenosis, what is going to happen there. Hidden life, totally unknown. And that's probably most all our lives, just totally going through unknown. We can relate to Jesus on that level. His public life, he enters the marketplace. Now, a lot of people have public lives. Some totally into the religious life and everything else. But we can relate to that. After being hidden, going through all this, and then coming out and wanting to help others in their spiritual life, we can relate that to Jesus. His own mystical experiences, my goodness, oneness with God, his transfiguration, his telling us about that spirit leaping in him and coming out, and like that woman that was cured, he felt that spirit within him move. And a number of times he talked about that spirit in him moving there. And at his baptism, think of all the spiritual experiences that man had. And he was even tempted. And remember, this temptation, it's very interesting. It's just so interesting. I hate to say it, but when I heard that Buddha was tempted, I tended to link this with Jesus being tempted. Because at one time I wrote down, I can't remember it now, those 3 temptations he had. They were all to seize, it's like saying I'm God. They all had to do with that, putting himself up. Putting himself up on top. All 3 of those. He could have gone down and declared, I am this, I am that, this kind of thing here. And why didn't he do that? He's not going to do any of that. And one monk came out with his view, and listen, he was, the 2 of them. He's Camaldolese, and he's the prior of a monastery in Italy, Father Mario. And he's the one that pointed out, in his broken English, at one of the sermons I heard, he pointed out how people wanted to cage Jesus, to make him an idol, to make him a miracle worker, make him a prophet. He calls it caging him. That's what his Italian word for it. Put him in a cage, put him up on this pedestal, do this kind of thing. And what he wanted to make clear to us is that Jesus would not permit this to happen. Now, I just talked to you about gurus. They permit this to happen. They're big gurus, they're enlightened, they're everything else, and everybody can flock to them. Jesus tried to avoid that. That we have constant references in his 3 years of his running off, constantly leaving the crowd, dumping them, getting away from them. They all gathered around wanting to see some miracle, have something done here. And that wasn't what he was about. As he said, the only miracle was that they would have faith. He wasn't here to cure everybody. He wasn't some miracle worker. But I remember they brought it out strongly, this Father Mario, that how they wanted to make an idol out of Jesus, and that even, well, the implications we shouldn't either. Yeah, the whole implications that we shouldn't either. And I agree with that. Because you want to cage him in as this particular and the particular and everything else, you know. Let him go. Let him go. He was what he was. He did what he did. And he fulfilled God's will for him, that was for sure. And it wasn't to be some idol for people. In fact, how could you make an idol of somebody? You know what is so amazing? That Jesus' death. What if he died of old age or gone off someplace? What would we have thought of his death then? Would Christianity have been negated? Would he have been less Christ? That this man had died of old age someplace, maybe in some luxurious place. Would that have negated Christianity? What would have been the effect there? But anyway, God wanted to be sure that nobody missed his death. Why? You see, that figure, that icon of Jesus on the cross is the huge mystery of man. It's the mystery of death. The main icon of Christianity is the mystery of death. This man on the cross, that's death. And the mystery of his death is a mystery of our death too. And it's not just the organs giving out. That's the whole notion of medical death. If the organs cease to function, well, then you're dead. And that is why God dramatized the death of Christ the world over. It's huge. This is a big dramatization. Nobody can forget this. This is the big icon of Christianity. It's this death. It's this man on the cross. It's huge. Of course, I think that they all relate that to this poor man suffering for us or something like that. It had nothing to do with it. This is the mystery of death that man really, that gets him. That gets him right there. What is that? How does that work? What does that mean? And what's left afterwards? It has nothing to do with the organs. That's nothing but the cessation of the physical organs. And that's a whole medical view. A lot of people seem to think that when those organs cease, well, the soul can't function anymore, so it leaves. Well, you see, if the soul is the life of the body, and the body's not going to function anymore, well, then what is its life? See, this is, really give this some thought. That body doesn't cease to exist when that so-called people think the soul is gone. There is no separation ever of body and soul. And some of the fathers also believe that. Jesus' body and soul were never separated. As he said, one of them said, they were both united to the Logos. Both united to God. They can never be separated. You could no more separate body and soul than you could separate the Logos and the Spirit. The Logos one with the flesh, the Spirit one with the soul. You cannot separate and divide up God like that. And you cannot divide up the body and soul like that. There is no souls popping in and out of bodies, such as they think of a reincarnation. That's a reincarnation. That's not death and that's not resurrection. So this is the huge mystery. And Christ actually, from the cross, he shouted it out. He said God had abandoned him, but you have to understand his state to understand it. You have to understand the state of somebody who lived his whole life in oneness with God. Now, if you just say, you know, first he was some criminal and God left him, I don't know how you would say a thing like that. But I mean, here's this revered man, all he did, and his whole life behind him of oneness with God, just claiming that he died for that reason. After dying for the reason, then suddenly said God left him. What a contradiction. He died because he was one, put to death because he's one, and suddenly at his death he said God left him. Well, this is the real mystery of death. Of course, God doesn't come and go. God reveals, but God does not come and go. God reveals itself at some point, and at some point reveals something else. This was a revelation of God, what happened to him. That was actually another revelation of God. Namely, that in God, in your eternal life, there is no self. There is no person. You have ceased now that this man, the person Jesus, is gone. But human nature is still there. This did not, you see, human nature is not person. And the human nature was still there. But it's no longer his human nature. Impossible. So now he's going to learn in the resurrection just what this is that remains when there's no God for the self. Because the two are like one. As I said, the experience of God is the experience of your life. And you don't experience your life anymore, so you don't experience God anymore. And now you realize that Christ is not a person. God is not a person. And those who think that you can start talking about all these persons in heaven, well, they're going to be disappointed. There's only one person in heaven. I remember telling my friend that. And she said, I said, there's only one person in heaven. I said, and that's Christ. And she said, you mean I'm not going to see my mom and daddy when I get there? And I said, you're going to know your mom and daddy like God knows them, like Christ knows them. Christ, you're going to have the mind of Christ, and you will know like Christ knows. And you will know your parents and what happened to your parents exactly as God knows them, as Christ knows them. And well, she thought that didn't bother her too much. And so that's pretty much how it's going to go. As I said, you have the mind of Christ. We will no longer know as we know each other or ourselves or God or anything. It's going to be as God knows only. This is what we call the mind of Christ. And we are going to have the body of Christ. And this is his whole glorified body. It's not going to be the body that we know now. And of course, the best example of this heavenly divine body, the transfigured, transformed body of Christ, is everything we call the Eucharist. And I have a whole chapter on that, and it's really very beautiful. It's very beautiful. You know, I want to tell you about the Eucharist. This, of course, I have a whole thing on it here, and we're going to go over it. But just bringing up just mentioning the Eucharist. Irenaeus is the one who said that the Eucharist, this is his definition of it, the Eucharist is the continuation of the Incarnation. It's a continuation of the Incarnation. This is our becoming the incarnate Christ. We're being transformed into Christ. This is what the Eucharist does. This is what it is. It's the same thing. This is like Eckhart's, God being born in the soul, God infused into the soul. There was this, Origen had the view that the Son was ever being generated. He said, you know, the Logos is constantly generated like rays from the sun. It's eternally generated. And Meister Eckhart picked up on that. And he said that this is God, the Eucharist is God generating the Son into you, Christ into you, and transforming your human nature, becoming one with your human nature. This is the Logos becoming one with your human nature. That's what the Eucharist is. Transforming you into Christ. It's transformative, the Eucharist. And it's very beautiful. And what else was I going to say, but apart from Irenaeus' saying this, the Eucharist. Oh, yeah, I wanted to tell you this. Well, to some extent, it's my view, although I don't. You can take it or leave it. But the one thing that Jesus told them to do before he died, right before he died at the Last Supper, remember, that's when he took the bread and wine, and after blessing it and offering this up, he said, do this in remembrance of me. Do you remember that? So that is the only thing. Now, when he died, what else did he tell them to do? Of course, we have that inclusion, I think it's in Matthew, about go out and baptize. But that's iffy whether he ever said anything like that or not. But for sure, that when he said, do this in remembrance of me. So he's dead now. And of course, Pentecost has come and gone. And what are they going to do now, these apostles? Well, they're going to do the one thing that he said to do. You see, the apostles remained Jewish, at least those in Jerusalem. We know James was some kind of high priest, and they all went to the synagogue and kept the laws and everything else. It didn't seem to, change them at all. Initially, the Christianity, or what today we call Christianity, was looked upon a Jewish sect. These were just people who had these particular beliefs. But they did the one thing that Jesus ever asked them to do. And this was to remember him this way. And so they would get together on there was a big fight over whether it was a Sabbath or the Sunday, and enact this. And that's the only ritual that, to my knowledge, that they ever had, that your first apostles had and handed down and kept getting handed down in the church. The one thing that they did. They met together and they did exactly what Jesus told them to do. And I'm convinced that what happened, if you trace the history kind of this thing, in time, at first, they did not have this idea of God's being present or that Christ was present with them. But this evolved. They began to realize that something was happening here that was beyond, just a remembrance. They had experiences of this. This became a presence for them. And they didn't make this up. This is something that God made happen. I don't know what Jesus thought about this, but anyway, that was his idea of remembrance. But God is the one who made this wonderful thing happen because of it. So, that's my view, that they suddenly discovered that, because I was wondering at what time, at how early in the church did they recognize this as God's presence with them, as Christ's true presence. And it seems that by the time of Irenaeus, for sure it was, and 125, by that time it was. So I don't know at what time, in those 100-year span there, that they repeated this. They thought of it as somewhat as sacred bread, though, because they had been especially blessed in Christ's name. They kind of had this special sense of it. But when they actually regarded this as the true presence, they talk about it pretty early on, though. But I can't help but think that this was a surprise. That, just to say this. And I have here, I'm going to tell you what the Jewish priest told us. And I was at church in St. Monica's when he told us this story here. When Christ said, "Do this in remembrance of me." This Father Glassman, he was a Franciscan. And he used to give sermons. He was the best orator I've ever heard. And he would give sermons in the church periodically. And he gave us this sermon. They were great and beautiful. And he was a convert from Judaism. He was a convert. He was raised Jewish. And he became a priest. And he said, "You have no idea," he told all of us. He said, "what remembrance means to the Jewish people. It doesn't mean recall something. Or, remember somebody died on this date or anything else." He said what it meant to the Jewish people is you relive it. You relive it. And he talked to us about a number of things. It was really great. Because, if you've ever attended one of these Seder meals, they kind of reenact this little episode of being... marking on the doors and all that stuff there. I'm not going to go through that. I was at the only one Seder meal in my life, and it was pretty impressive, and it was beautifully done. I was amazed. You kind of enact this thing here, this Seder. It means a great deal. He said he remembers sitting on his grandpa's lap, listening over and over and over to his grandpa's escape from Czechoslovakia, during the persecution. He heard it over and over so well that he could repeat it. That's a little one. He could repeat the whole story that Grandpa's going. And he said, when he would tell the story, he relived it. The man was, look at this coming at me, how scared I was. This, they relive it. And the little boy went through the same emotions. Oh, his grandpa's going to get it now. What happened? Said, do you understand how this goes? When you say do it in remembrance of me, that's not what the Jewish means, just so remember it and then, go out and have a beer. It meant relive it, recreate it. And then Father said, when Jesus said, he didn't say just recall me. He said relive me, recreate me. Represent. I'm present, represent me. And that's what it meant to the Jews, more or less. And as Father explained it. And I think that's a very, very, very beautiful understanding of what the term remembrance means. That you relive and you create.